today's video, I'm going to show you how to work with resource clusters in Lula Build. So as I've already explained, Lula Build is a so-called first principle driven cost estimation platform. What that means is that all costs and processes in Lula Build are modeled in terms of so-called resources. But it is often quite common for certain resources to work together in teams. And when you're busy pricing the project, it's not always convenient to have to price and pull in all of the different individual resources, but you might want to just pull in a team of resources that you reuse in various different worksheets of bill items. So a few examples of such teams of resources would, for example, be a material mixture. So let's say mortar would consist of some cement, some building sand, and some building mortar. And whenever you need mortar in the job, you just want to be able to pull all three of those resources in as a unit. Another example would be a plant unit, which would consist of the machine itself, some fuel consumption, as well as an operator. Right, so Lula Build provides a module to build such resource teams, and they are called resource clusters in Lula Build. So currently, I don't have any clusters defined in this project. And to create a new cluster, you can simply click the plus add button at the bottom of the table. This will add a cluster and automatically launch the cluster editor. All right, so in the cluster editor, you've got your cluster explorer on the left-hand side, where you can browse and explore the internal resources of this cluster, which is currently empty. You've got a calculation sheet in the middle, where you will specify all of the individual resources that form part of this cluster. And you've got some action tabs on the right hand side here where you can edit the properties and pull in some resources and so forth. All right, so I'm going to open up the info tab, and here I can specify the basic properties of this cluster. So a cluster has a code, a name, a unit, it's got some tags that you can assign to it, and you can add some comments or remarks on this cluster. All right, the code is just some unique identifier, which I'm just going to leave a C1 for now. The name, so let's say I want to create this mortar cluster that I was speaking of. So I'm just going to give it a name, mortar. And let's say we want to calculate how much it's going to cost us per cube of mortar. All right, so I'm giving it a unit of per cube. Okay, so if I now want to insert resources into the calculation sheet of this cluster, I can open up this insert tab, which will automatically bring up my full list of resources defined in this project. You've also got the option to pull in resources here from some of your previous projects or from some of your libraries. So as you can see, the data source is currently set to my local project, but I can click and select another data source that's attached to this project, and then it'll display the resources from a different project, which I can then reuse in this project. All right, but for now, I'm just going to use my local resources. And to insert any of these resources into your calculation sheet, you've got a few options. You can either simply just double click on a resource. So let's say we want to insert the cement pockets. I can double click and automatically it appears in my calculation sheet. Or alternatively, you can select the resources that you want to insert and click the insert selected button. Right, and if this list gets large, you've got the option to search and filter for different resources in your project as well. All right, so I now have pulled in some resources into the calculation sheet, but take note that we want to calculate the cost of mortar per cube, but the resources themselves aren't all priced per cube. So the cement is priced per pocket, building sand is priced per kiloliter. So we've actually got to transform these allowables and their units so that they match the parent unit of the cluster, which is cubes. Right, so Lula Build provides you with a transform column where you can fill in any sort of mathematical formula which you can use to transform the allowable and the unit of that specific resource. Right, so to edit or to fill in a transform, you simply double click and it goes into editing mode. So in this case, let's say we use 6 pockets of cement per cube of mortar. So I'm just going to multiply this with 6 pockets per cube. And note that everything in square brackets in the transform is essentially just a comment and it gets ignored by the equation compiler. So that just helps you when you come back to understand what your calculations meant. So I've just reminded myself that that 6 is the transform taking me from pockets to cubes, but the equation compiler just ignores everything in square brackets. All right, so we need 6 pockets per cube, and let's say we waste a little bit of the cement while we're mixing it as well. So I'm going to allow for some wastage. So I'm going to multiply it by 1.05 waste. So I'm allowing for 5% waste when I'm mixing this mortar. Right, the building sand. So let's say we use 0.85 cubes of building sand for every cube of mortar that we mix. And let's also allow for about 5% waste on the building sand. Okay, the building water is priced per kiloliter. So I'm going to first transform it from kiloliters to liters, and then from liters to cubes. So I'm going to divide this by 1,000 liters per kiloliter. And let's say we use 60 liters per cube of mortar that gets mixed. Right, so now we can see in the transformed allowable that we use 63 pounds of cement for every cube of mortar mixed, and there is 80 pounds that contributes towards the building sand, and we've got 2 cents going towards the building water, and in total we can now see that it is costing us 143 pounds to mix 1 cube of mortar. Alright, so wherever I need to use mortar in my project now, I can simply make use of this mortar cluster instead of having to individually pull in all of the resources and specifying their mixing ratios over and over again. So it not only makes it easier to reason about the project, but it also greatly speeds up the speed at which you can develop an estimate. Alright, so in this example, I've only pulled in resources into my cluster, but if you open up the insert tab, you'll see that you've actually also got the option to pull in other clusters into a cluster. So I don't have any other clusters defined in this project, but you can layer teams in terms of complexity. So you can have teams within teams and so forth, and really model any scenario on your construction site in this way. Okay, so in these transforms, we also allow you to use any variables that you defined. So you can use global variables in these calculations if you have defined any global variables for this project. Or you can define a local variable that is only visible to this specific cluster itself. So let's say we're not yet sure of the wastage in this mortar mixture, and we actually want to model the wastage with a variable. So I'm going to go ahead and create a local variable by opening up the variables tab, and if I double click on that, I can give it an identifier and some description. So I'm just going to give it identifier W, call it waste, and let's say we've got 1.05 waste when mixing the mortar. Right, so now instead of hard coding it in these lines, I can simply go and use my variable that I've defined. And all variables in calculations must be wrapped in these sharp curly braces. So I'm just going to wrap W in there. Right, and similarly, I'm going to model that with W. Right, so now if I want to update my wastage, I don't need to go and update it in 2 different places. I can simply edit the wastage here, and automatically the calculations will be updated. And as mentioned, this is a local variable, so I can use another W in any of my other clusters, and it will be completely disconnected to this W, which is local to this cluster. And in a similar way, you can use any of your global variables in these calculations as well. Right, so you can build up and model any of your on-site conditions in this way. And as mentioned, when you're pricing your worksheets and your build items now, you can make use of both your resources and your clusters to model your on-site working conditions. Okay, that's all for today, and until next time.